Welcome to Cap Times Idea Fest 2025. My name is Becky Jacobs, and I'm an education reporter at the Cap Times who reports on universities and colleges in the Madison region. Today's panel is titled A Singular Moment: How the World Can and Should Change in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Changes driven by the arrival of powerful artificial intelligence tools are already unnoticeable, but many commentators say the rise of AI will be among the most profound changes in the history of humanity. We have an outstanding panel of experts to discuss the changes we are likely to see on the horizon and how we should respond to them. Alta Charo is a professor emerita of law and bioethics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Law and Medical Schools. She was a member of President Clinton's National Bioethics Advisory Commission and a senior policy advisor at the Food and Drug Administration during the Obama administration. She now works as a consultant to biotechnology companies and government agencies. Alondra Nelson is a professor at the Institute for Advanced Study. Nelson's academic background is in the study of race and technology, and she recently served as acting director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where she led the development of the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. Nature magazine named her to its global list of 10 people who shaped science in 2022, and she was on the Time 100 list of the most influential people in AI in 2023. Dietram Scheufele is the Taylor Bascom Chair and Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor at UW-Madison and an investigator in the Morgridge Institute for Research. He is a widely cited expert in the fields of political communication, science communication, and science and technology policy. And last but not least, Annette Zimmermann is an assistant professor of philosophy and an affiliate professor of statistics at UW-Madison, where they also co-lead the Uncertainty and AI Group, an interdisciplinary research team that studies artificial intelligence with social science and humanities tools. Zimmermann's first book, Democratizing AI, is forthcoming this year. Thank you all for joining us today. In preparing for this panel, I read about how AI is an existential threat. Some say AI has the power to change the course of humanity and compared its impact to the Industrial Revolution. Are these kinds of descriptions overhyping the potential of AI, underestimating it, right on? This is a question open to everyone to kick off this discussion.
Well, let me get us started. I think it's fascinating that the main people who are pushing this idea that there is an existential threat are also the ones who happen to offer tools for mitigating those risks and obviously benefiting financially from that. So what we see right now is not only a massive concentration of power, wealth, and information in big tech, but also a kind of ideological shift in this direction of saying that only the select few, and those are usually, white American tech bros, hold the keys to our future. So that's why I think we need to start thinking critically. That's exactly where we should use our powers of scrutiny to really explore whether some other perspectives might be needed.
And I think that split is right on, and maybe add another element to it. I mean, if you look at people like Elon Musk, it's maybe the epitome of a tech bro. He called for a moratorium on AI at the same time that he's got his XAI off the ground. So hedging bets is another key thing that we're seeing. I think it's certainly one of the more disruptive technologies, but not the first one. Many people on this panel know as much or more than I do about this. CRISPR was at some point, new genome editing tools were discussed in kind of the same way, right? We could edit the human germline in ways that would be inherited by future generations. And AI, I think, is in a very the language surrounding AI is in a very similar space. But when we asked experts, this was just a few years ago, and we asked experts, for example, if there would be unintended consequences. These are people that have published on AI that are experts in the field. 9 and 10 said, yes, there will be unintended consequences. And about 3 and 4 said, look, we're utterly unprepared for those consequences. So regardless of where this is really going, experts are not just worried that there are going to be consequences, but we as a society, partly for the reasons that Annette outlined, are unprepared for it.
If I may add, though, stepping back for a second, I think there's something really interesting about the societal effects that occur when you have a massive increase in the efficiency of something. To take a completely separate topic, but to use it as an analogy, when people had very uncertain means for preventing conception, there was a kind of natural friction in the system. There was a natural reason why people wouldn't engage in sexual activity indiscriminately because of the fear of pregnancy. The birth control pill comes around. It's massively more effective. And suddenly you have a sexual revolution in which there's pressure on women, for example, to give up the reluctance to have sexual intercourse prior to marriage because, of course, pregnancy is no longer this natural limiting factor. And it really changes the fabric of society in interesting ways in the 1960s. And I think we see this repeatedly with something that has enormous, kind of logarithmic increases in efficiencies. You have to ask, is there some natural limiting factor? So when it comes to things like in vitro fertilization and people speculating we were all going to make test tube babies and we were all going to use CRISPR to create designer babies, the fact is you had to start with IVF, and IVF is expensive and unpleasant, and it's a natural limiting factor. So yes, it expanded, but it's a contained expansion. So I think the open question with artificial intelligence is, sorry, my mind goes to reproduction. Artificial intelligence is, are there natural limiting factors that will contain it in ways that also contain the societal effects? Or is it uncontrolled? And does that then invite something that's really more fundamental in how it'll change the way we all behave at a planetary level?
Well, this has queued me up perfectly because I think we're being told that there are no natural limits. This is me with my kind of former policymaker hat on. Any limits that we would need to create are human limits, so that we would need to say, we want these technologies to have these outcomes and not these outcomes. We want them to be, beneficial for education, both at the K-12 level and the university level. But we also can make the choice that says we want to do that in a way that's not, purloining data from young people, that's not getting, our young people sort of addicted to working with chatbots, that's preserving people's privacy, that is continuing to increase people's ability to do critical thinking and not just sort of augmenting or replacing that. So there's a lot of choice space in these tools for us. And so I think the challenge, to go back to your initial question, Becky, is that part of what the hype cycle does, that we are all culpable and participants in as well. I mean, I'm excited when I wake up in the morning and someone says, we have just done a thing that's going to do X thing. This morning it was something about some new research that suggests that research in mice can reverse autism. I mean, like, if we were able to do that, I mean, that's amazing. And so it is certainly, as Professor Zimmermann said, definitely the market impulses, right? It is certainly the case that we get excited about these things, but this excitement leads us to, as with the Human Genome Project, think it's the Holy Grail, think that it's the sort of blueprint of all of life. And so there's no way we should try to ever stop or get in the way of what, quote unquote, naturally will be occurring. And so I think what we need to do is sort of, get our wits about us, and realize that these are tremendously powerful tools. They might be tremendously beneficial, but that's not, none of that we hope for, none of the, like, when I wake up and I'm excited about a technology, in most cases, the thing that I'm excited about is not an inherent characteristic of the technology, right? It's about how we are going to place that technology in institutions with guardrails and use cases that make it have that socially powerful outcome.
You led me right into my next question I was hoping each of you could provide an example of something that excites or intrigues you around artificial intelligence right now, and what's something that maybe you're hesitant or wary related to AI. If anyone would like to go first?
I mean, I think, I've just been writing this short essay for Science, actually, and I've called this AI's cruel summer. I mean, I think the news cycle over the last 3 months for AI, particularly with regards to young people in regard to vulnerable communities. I'm talking about chatbots in particular. There's a wide swath of tools and technologies we call AI. But, the mental health risks to society, the fact that we are releasing these tools without pre-deployment testing. I saw this morning that there's reporting that OpenAI is going to, soon roll out parental controls for chatbots. I mean, the fact that we have released these powerful tools for use with young people without even the controls that you would have on a cable television, system is actually, tremendously worrisome. So I think that we don't know what the denominator is for these things. So the thing with news reporting, when you don't have, guardrails, and we don't have institutional systems to sort of be doing trust and safety around these technologies, is that you don't know what the floor is, like what are all of the things that are happening. And so we probably overinvest in the news reports of these sort of very terrible instances, but these instances are occurring. There was another case also, I think in New York State, of a person being falsely arrested and identified by facial recognition technology. So these things just keep happening, and we still have not solved those problems. I mean, I am very hopeful for what AI might mean for educational outcomes. I mean, we've learned a lesson. We put a laptop in every classroom, we put a laptop in every lab, and we still have educational inequality. And so if we can get beyond the hype and sort of actually think about how these tools might be useful for young people who are in under-resourced classrooms, that's tremendously exciting. We have non-generative AI applications, things like AlphaFold, that are helping us to know much more about structural chemistry, and that might really change how we're able to do genomic medicine. That's super exciting. And then the case I always go back to, that because it occurred when I was working in the Biden administration, is just the ability to the brute force of calculation that AI can do, and this is not generative AI, that can be used for science. And so during my time in the Biden administration, NASA was able to do work in which they showed that they could take, if there was an asteroid careening towards the United States or careening towards Earth, they could take it off its orbit, right, and make it non-dangerous to the United States. And that was done with kind of the brute force of like years and years of using AI for simulation and calculation. So I'm excited about those kinds of applications as well.
So for me, I think my mind tends to go to the dual use issues, because as Alondra has already mentioned in passing, artificial intelligence allows us to query tremendous amounts of information from research that's been done in the past, substances that have been used in the past, combinations of things that have been done in the past. And it can elicit a series of observations about associations that can create very strong hypotheses about how you might create a new substance that would have certain kinds of properties, has highly effective predictive abilities that simply massively increase our creativity and the speed with which we can follow up on these kinds of intuitions. And so that might mean that we would have a world of not only new kinds of drugs, but new kinds of substances, new kinds of energetics for our transportation and military, new kinds of concrete for build things, new kinds of drugs, obviously. So in any number of things. And at the same time, it may also reveal many, many more ways of creating things that are incredibly either dangerous to create and use, or reveal vulnerabilities in things that we're already creating and using that we hadn't yet perceived and that could now be exploited. And we don't really have yet a solid way, either at the national level, let alone at the transnational level, to govern the discovery process and the application of those discoveries in a way that lets us benefit from all the beneficial uses while minimizing the risk of some of these untoward, nefarious uses or accidental misuses that could be dangerous. So I don't have an answer to this, but you asked what intrigues us and worries us, and I would say it's that.
And maybe if I can jump in on that, because this highlights the unintentional or the intentional uses in dual use research. My head is right now in a maybe unintended kind of consequence space, mostly related to hallucinations. So the inability of AI to produce ground truth, right? It doesn't have ground truth. It makes probabilistic judgments at any given moment about predictions and accurate answers. And we're in a world, and this is, I'm about to go and teach this week for the first time again, my undergrad course, 250 students. And for them, for that generation, as it is becoming for ours, the information environment is increasingly going to be AI governed. Every Google search is Gemini enhanced. articles in the LA Times now, counterpoints to op-eds are written by AI with very limited success so far, but it'll get better at this. So all of our information intake will be somehow governed by AI, or is already governed by AI, and that's our new epistemic tool, with very little appreciation, I think, among most of us, that a good chunk of what's coming our way is inaccurate. And that's very different from misinformation or disinformation, where I know that there are nefarious actors out there, or I'm double checking, I'm snoping information because I think that if I see it on TikTok or Twitter, it might not be true. Here, I have an expectation both from the platform that's claiming, if I give it a prompt saying, give me a correct answer, that the LLM is giving me one. I have the expectation as a user, and the platform has to claim that it's giving me an accurate answer. It may still be utterly wrong. Google and others have referred to this as I think, AGI, the jagged intelligence, right? Artificial jagged intelligence. We're really good at Alondra mentioned AlphaFold. We're really good at solving these super sophisticated scientific problems. But AI is really bad sometimes at even recognizing an April Fool's joke as false, right? And so, and as a result, it's just not where it needs to be. Yet we're relying on it for accurate information. And it's partly salient because one of my PhD students just finished a dissertation on the topic. But this is one of those spaces where we have an information ecology that we all rely on, that has an error rate, and Annette can probably talk to this much more coherently than I can. But where the error rate is just very, very different and unpredictable, at least at the moment, than where it should be, and where most likely we'll never fully be able to get rid of hallucinations, period. They're asymptotically going to reach some form of minimum, but they're not going to go away entirely. And I think at the moment, we as audience members, as viewers, as listeners, are utterly unprepared in terms of literacy for that new kind of information environment, where we're assuming truth is coming our way and it is not.
I think while everyone is getting swept up in an AI arms race yet again, it's very easy to forget that older, dumber forms of AI are still everywhere. It's very easy to just think about AI's, medium-term future, particularly in the generative AI space. But of course, older forms of AI that are used right now by little firms, by municipalities that want to make some sort of pretty simple bureaucratic process more efficient. These processes feature tools that, as Dietram just pointed out, are really, really prone to very well understood and often moderately fixable kinds of problems. The issue is just that we kind of opt out of doing that because we kind of think, well, this will do just fine in this kind of smaller context. So I kind of worry about a lot of nonchalance about preventable harm in those domains, just because those kinds of problems simply aren't flashy enough to attract enough attention. Everyone wants to talk about the 13-year-old boy who gets totally delusional after talking to ChatGPT. That's a very flashy and very gripping problem case. And of course, we should focus on that. But we should also not ignore the kind of complex tapestry of additional problems that actually remain unsolved, that are to some degree solvable, but that just don't have this glamour around them, right? This kind of attention-grabbing quality. So I think that's one thing to bear in mind as we look forward. I share others' enthusiasm about applications like AI for science. Alondra Nelson mentioned this very persuasively before. I think that's exactly where a lot of positive potential lies in both education and just scientific discovery. Again, here, I think the most transformative thing we can do is think really hard about what kinds of purposes and questions are going to be the most productive going forward. Right? So like people love to say like pattern recognition is the thing that will unlock so many new discoveries. But it's really non-trivial to define what kinds of discoveries matter for society. right? So we could either say, well, let's try to use this tool to detect patterns and, what kinds of groups of people are most likely to commit some sort of fraud. Or we could ask, like, which people are routinely underserved in this kind of bureaucratic process, right? These are very different questions that might happen in exactly the same domain. Both might be legitimate questions to ask, depending on, what other problems we want to solve. But I think it's really non-obvious that often the first question gets picked, right? And that is something where I think we could broaden out our kind of view about what a good problem to solve actually looks like. And that could be much more productive than just trying to speed up in whatever direction was already picked for us by a smaller group of people.
If I may follow up on something that Annette mentioned, talking about broadening and the kinds of things that you might ask. I think all of us here are very sensitive to the problem of bias in the data that has been used to train AI and to query for answers. That broadening is going to be crucial because not only are there large areas of information that are not available that bias the sample. For example, information from rural hospitals may not be nearly as present in the data as information from urban hospitals. That has a huge impact on the kind of population that's being studied, the kind of association between diagnosis, treatment, and outcome that the models are being trained on. And it may wind up giving very fundamentally incorrect proposals for what kind of treatment has what kind of effectiveness, because it's actually based on a population that of a certain income level, certain ethnicity, certain dietary types, whatever. It also has the problem of always being looking at older data. That is, it's always basing everything on older patterns that don't necessarily match the way people live today, let alone how they will live 10 and 20 years from now. So when you ask Annette, what happens when it tries to make a prediction about which people are more likely to do X, it's basing it on what people who are like them based on some arbitrary collection of variables that they assume are the most salient ones for defining likeness, and then looking backwards, which may be that they're looking backwards at a time when there was, biased prosecution of crimes. And so people of certain income or ethnicity or regional characteristics are now assumed to be more likely to be criminals when in fact it was that they were more likely to be identified, picked up, and prosecuted. So we have this tremendous challenge of trying to democratize the data and to modernize the data so that it doesn't not only build in biases to the answers it gives, but to pick up on Alondra's point, exacerbate inequalities from the past by now making predictions into the future that reify those inequalities in a way that makes them normative. And that is really worrisome. And I have no idea how to solve that problem. But I do know that a lot of people have been identifying bits and pieces of that problem.
Alta, I wonder if you could expand on that a bit. Up ahead of this panel, we talked about a couple of the challenges around AI. You touched on this of we have to make sure the data AI is trained on is not distorting the outcomes it's producing. You also raised the issue of we need to resist the temptation to over-rely on AI tools. Can you expand a little bit on the thread that you were going on there and some of the challenges you're thinking about?
Well, what we saw in earlier eras in which there's a technically sophisticated approach to things being introduced is that we often will over rely on those to the detriment of our own intuitions. And I think Dietram kind of hinted at this as well in some of what he was saying. So when you look, for example, back into the 1980s and 90s, when we were introducing DNA forensic evidence into trials, we found that often not only did the experts and the judges and frankly the defense and prosecuting attorneys tend to overestimate the reliability, underestimate the error factors in the use of DNA forensics, but that juries tended to be incredibly influenced by them, often to the point of ignoring what their own intuition said based on other kinds of more traditional evidence. And that tells me that we have to be very, very careful as we look at how AI is now being used, whether it's in medical diagnosis and treatment questions, or I'm hearing now about therapists that are relying on ChatGPT responses for some of their clients, that we do not fall into this trap. And it's a very easy trap to fall into, both because we do have a tremendous, most of us at least, well, some of us have a great respect for science. It seems to be a shrinking number, but we have a great respect for science. And so we want to give it the authority that it seems to deserve. And second, because it always seems so clean and precise compared to the messiness of our own thought processes. And so it's very tempting to, that's the answer, right? I think all of us as educators have had the experience of students being uncomfortable at teaching to the ambiguities when they're like, what is the answer, for goodness sake? And sometimes there is no single clean answer, but AI can give that impression. So those are just purely kind of human failings that we've seen in other contexts, and we have to be aware of them and try to guard against them.
I totally agree with that take. Actually, when we pitched our uncertainty and AI research group on the UW-Madison campus, our pitch was something like, well, AI gives us this false air of certainty. And it's actually really important to make enough room for uncertainty about what the correct answer might be or what problem we should even be trying to solve. I think that's very important. I think there's an additional problem, though, which has become much more salient, especially in recent months. And that problem is that even if companies are able to fix particular bias issues, or like users that interact with these tools are able to spot some things that might be suboptimal, I think there are increasingly pragmatic incentives to not intervene in those ways. My favorite example of this is the recent controversy surrounding Meta's policy on generative AI outputs. So we know that generative AI tools, much like earlier forms of AI, will replicate all sorts of socially salient stereotypes in a very damaging way. And so Meta obviously had thought about this, and they had given themselves some rules about what kinds of outputs are going to count as permissible and which ones won't. This got leaked, and it was actually astonishing just how permissive Meta wanted to be. This, I think, is part of a broader trend of tech companies pushing back against this idea that they should be very active in mitigating biases. There's a kind of anti-woke tendency going on in parts of the tech industry. And that's something that actually means that even if we could potentially intervene with some sort of debiasing efforts, more and more, there are going to be cross-cutting incentives, especially for some practitioners in industry, not to use that ability to the fullest extent. And so that can undermine these efforts in a particularly pernicious way too. It's not just that well-intentioned human decision makers are biased, like automation bias, they just don't intervene. It's also actually that they know exactly what's going on, but they're incentivized not to do something about it.
And
I want to go ahead, Dietram.
No, is it okay to jump in really quickly just on that theme of both equity and bias? Because I think there are a couple additional thoughts. One, going in exactly the same direction that Annette just outlined, but that the economic incentives also don't align with equitable fixing or mitigation of bias. So we're seeing different professional fields where, let's say law, right, where we've seen very, very prominent examples of people in various court proceedings using generative AI to write amicus briefs, whatever else, and being called out for it. And now every law firm spends tens of thousands of dollars a month in AI tools that are getting better and better and better and better. And we're fixing problems in a space where there's a financial incentives, and we're not fixing problems in all the other areas that Annette and others have outlined so far, where maybe there's societally much more urgent, but less fiscally interesting kind of set of problems to tackle. And then the second one is we in academia actually produce or help exacerbate some of those issues. There's a great study, I think, that Max Planck put out that showed that as academics are using more and more generative AI tools and bots, we sound more and more like those bots. We use some of the same language, and then flip that around, of course, where do those bots learning from? Or who and what do they learn from? And the answer is from our papers and from our academic output. So we're creating this spiral of us learning from AI and sounding more and more like the bot, and then feeding bots that same language back, and kind of in an incestuous way producing a narrower set of discourses, and without all the complexities, or with all the complexities stripped out that we all just outlined. So I think even our own approaches and our own taking advantage of what are very exciting tools, and fully agree with all my panelists on the exciting applications in areas of science. But even there, I think we're very often producing some of the same biases that we're bemoaning and criticizing in other areas.
Annette, I was going to ask, I was looking at your website about your upcoming book, and Annette, you posed this interesting question of, just because generative AI is at all of our fingertips, that does not mean it is truly in our hands. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's very common amongst tech industry practitioners to say that their tools will benefit all of us. And so that's what really matters, right? It's that we passively and ideally graciously receive these miraculous benefits. And that makes it okay that nobody really asked citizens at large what kinds of purposes and what kinds of problems they wish to pursue collectively when they're dealing with technological innovation. That's a big problem. I don't think we typically define democratizing domain X as, oh, you kind of get something out of it, and that's that. Usually, democratizing something means that you actually have a say as a free and equal participant in some process. Oddly, democratizing AI has been somehow redefined. I want to push back against that. I don't think it's enough that most people can now just use ChatGPT and help big companies train those tools and optimize them further for free. I think much more is required. So I want regular citizens to be much more directly involved in collective decisions about the kinds of places that we want AI to take in our society. Whenever I say this to people, the reaction I get is, well, we don't have any clue about AI, we're not trained computer scientists. And to that, I say, there are many complex domains of decision-making where it's possible to articulate the kinds of values and goals that are important to you and me without having a PhD in that domain. Think about climate change policy. I don't have a meteorology PhD, but I definitely have some normative preferences about how important it is to mitigate global warming as a problem. And I would bet a lot of other people do too. And so equally, I think, if you just ask regular citizens about their value-based preferences on what it would be like to have a supercharged surveillance state or a social credit scoring system, most people would be able to tell you, my gut instinct says no, because that might undermine my freedoms as a citizen. And so these are the kinds of conversations that we can have as a society without requiring that every single person has highly advanced technical knowledge. So it's important to recognize how many aspects of technological innovation actually don't come down to purely technical questions at the end of the day. There's actually a lot more we can collectively decide on when we think about it.
Alondra, you worked on the blueprint for AI Bill of Rights. We also saw a recent proposal in Congress, which ultimately failed, that would have deterred states from regulating AI over the next decade. This is a lofty question, but can you bring us up to speed on where we stand today with AI regulation and what you would like to see happen?
Yeah, sure. So we can go back just a couple of years. So during the Biden administration, there was a policy framework that I and others worked in called the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that took precisely the approach that Professor Zimmermann just outlined. And I'm very much looking forward to reading her book, which is to say, this was a document that you can still find online that was addressed to the American public. So the subtitle of it was Making Automated Systems Work for the American People. And, it had 5 principles, which said that people should have some modicum of data privacy, that you should know if an AI system is being used for a consequential decision, a big decision in your life, that if a decision is reached and you don't agree with it, or you want to know more information, you should be able to find someone to tell you something about that. That there should be protections against algorithmic discrimination, types of bias that we were talking about. And so all of these things are really about how do you get what are the values, to Professor Zimmermann's point, and then how do you get, and what are those American and democratic values, and how do you get to those outcomes? And working with technology companies, working with academic researchers, there's a lot of work that we have to do to get to those outcomes. And so I think as a nation, we still very much need to get to a place where we can agree or find a way to agree. And I do think that AI policy is one of the last remaining potentially bipartisan areas for policy. So, you know, and I think that we also see in the polling data, so there's Pew Research data, there's data from the Edelman Trust Barometer and other organizations and survey and polling organizations. And, you know, the American public is sort of widely mistrustful, up to 60% often, of AI. They're worried about work. They're worried about energy. They're worried about the effects on climate and pollution of these big data centers that are going up in lots of communities that might be providing some, certainly construction jobs and some employment, but also will be exacerbating, you know, cost of electricity, strain on the electrical grid, and maybe pollution in communities, including sound pollution, as they kind of create this kind of hum, light pollution. So I think, what's the state of play? I mean, I think that we tried to, in the Biden administration, there was an AI executive order that the Trump administration rescinded. But I will say to you that, you know, now out of politics, that you won't be surprised to hear that politics is very performative. And even though the framing of those policies, those executive orders, were talked about in very different ways, they share some fundamental similarities. One, I think, understanding that we need to do something to mitigate, there's different, you know, perspectives and a spectrum of action on this, mitigate the toll that this might take on the American workforce. There's concerns about how and whether and when to use these tools in education and whether or not to accelerate that. There's concerns about how to enhance or increase innovation and how that, you know, to do it more responsibly if possible. But the big concern, I think the big difference between the administrations was, you mentioned, Becky, and the big beautiful bill was proposed to have a moratorium on state level legislation and regulation and governance of AI. That didn't advance in the last minute and at the last moment, and I think it was to the good, because, you know, we talk about our state legislators, often legislatures, as these kind of, you know, laboratories of democracy. I mean, one way to think about this is that if we are going to have federal level AI governance, AI regulation, AI policy, you might want an interesting, innovative state to try it out first to see if it even works. It might not work, right? So these are actually opportunities for innovation and policy innovation to sort of see what works and what doesn't work. And, you know, I think AI it's a big issue. It's a national security issue. It's an economic issue. We're seeing in some of the debates around the tariffs, and, you know, it's a big trade issue, whether or not American companies should be regulated. And so I think you'll continue to see the state of play, that you're going to continue to see AI sit in the very middle of these things, in part because why AI is so powerful is that we're building out a kind of new infrastructure for politics and economy and society. And it has everything to do with climate and economy, and how we're thinking about trade policy, how we're thinking about the cost of steel, whether or not we're going to ship semiconductor chips abroad or build them here, you know, whether we should be incentivizing companies or taking you know, a stake in companies. So all of these big issues, so sort of AI sits in the very center of them. So I think we'll continue to see a lot of, there'll be a lot of you know, kind of a rugby scrum around AI as a policy issue. And I think we'll continue to see a lot of debate. But I think fundamentally, from kind of an American, you know, capital A American perspective, you know, it's a technology that very much emerges from the US technology, you know, ecosystem. It's one that I think American politicians and policymakers see as a distinct American advantage, and one that I think Democrat or Republican, you know, that administrations want to continue to press forward. The sort of rub here is how do we do that without undermining our democratic values, upsetting and eroding, our social order, and decimating our climate. And so there's some strong trade-offs that need to be made and need to be debated. And the last thing I would say to Professor Zimmermann's excellent point about democratizing AI, that polling and survey data is not democracy, it's not electoral politics, but there are these moments in which we are hearing from the broader public what they think. And I think that the polls kind of swing a little bit back and forth here. But when you get fairly consistent polling since the introduction of ChatGPT in 2022 that shows real reservations and concern in the American public, it means that it's a time really for leadership and to be able, and if, one of the kind of, American goals here will be adoption of these tools sort of across the economy and across sectors of society. If you can't get the American public to adopt them and to trust them, then this kind of vision for where these technologies might be taking us will not come to pass. So there's a lot of, I think, hopefully incentives that I hope we might be able to align with, people who are just concerned about advancing the technologies and those who understand that you need a market of people who want to use them to be able to do that. That might put a little pressure on our ability to make sure that they're as unbiased as they can be, that they're, not dangerous, that they're not creating excessive risks and harms that could be known in advance.
One thing I might add very briefly on the governance and regulation area is something that Alondra's mentioned a couple of times, but not followed deeply, and she probably could if she has time. And that's the transnational governance questions, because we already have certain problems in transnational governance. For one thing, we don't have a global enforcement mechanism. We just don't. Everything is done through conventions and treaties and agreements, and it's all a little bit unstable because it depends upon incentives and disincentives for cooperation among countries, and that varies over time and with political leadership. But to the extent that we have it, there's already some ambiguities about, for example, biological research that is done for defensive purposes that has offensive uses. And I think AI is going to exacerbate those ambiguities in ways that are very potentially destabilizing. And we saw this with accusations about offensive biological weapon development in the context of the Ukraine war, where really it was about defensive research or completely unrelated research, but it's very hard for people to understand the differences. I think we also have, and this goes back a little bit to what Annette Zimmermann's been talking about, we have tremendous potential for the use of data for surveillance purposes and for creating these profiles. And we're already seeing this happen in some countries where people are being profiled for their social utility and their social conformity, and then they are being punished or rewarded, or their families are being punished and rewarded based upon the behavior of a single individual. That can be massively expanded. And it raises questions about how much we want our information to be used by another country that wants to profile our people for its own purposes. And there's already been controversies about the use of genetic data from US populations by other countries. And finally, agriculture, which never seems to get talked about nearly enough, even in Wisconsin, where it's a major factor. AI has enormous value for surveillance in order to do early detection of pest infestations, or for optimizing the use of various kinds of fertilizers, or even designing new kinds of fertilizers. But it also makes our agricultural system much more vulnerable to interventions. And this is something that former Governor Tommy Thompson focused on after 9/11, when he was the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And he was talking, and I think he was the only person talking about the vulnerability of our agricultural sector. So with AI governance, we have a huge challenge in developing some set of transnational norms accompanied by appropriate incentives for maintaining those norms at a time when we are already in a bit of an AI arms race. And those incentives are being undermined by that arms race.
Before we wrap up, we've touched a lot on ethics and questions that everyone can be thinking about. And Dietram, when we talked ahead of this panel, you raised an interesting hypothetical around self-driving cars and how they're programmed to make moral choices. You presented a hypothetical of you're in a self-driving car on University Avenue, you hit black ice. Does the car hit the group of undergrads crossing the street? Does it hit the elderly woman with the walker on the sidewalk? Or does it steer into the brick wall to only harm the driver? Can you walk us through this scenario and some of the questions that that's raising in your mind, Dietram?
It's a really good illustration, I think, of AI having neither a brain nor a soul, right? So it is trained based on data that we provided with. In the case of self-driving cars, we've crowdsourced thousands and thousands and thousands of scenarios. MIT and other places have to basically train an algorithm and a machine to make a decision in a split second that it recognizes as being super adjacent or as adjacent as possible to a scenario that it sees as the most moral one, which goes back to, I think, 1,000 or many of the different themes that we've covered over the course of this conversation, from bias in training data to outdated training data to the inability to really make a either true statement or a morally right or wrong statement. And I think that's partly looping back to the idea of why public engagement and upstream public engagement, as Annette and others outlined it, is so deeply important. The idea that, of course, I can bring values to a situation regardless of my technical understanding of the issue. And I think we're seeing even, I think, fairly smart, very, very smart representatives of the AI industry like Demis Hassab, is it DeepMind and others, use the exact same trope that we've seen for other technologies. Well, we're not there yet, right? We don't have to worry about that just yet because the technology is not good enough. The problem is the moment the technology is good enough to be deployed, it will be deployed, and it will be way too late for those conversations with particularly vulnerable populations or people that are going to be most affected by it. And number two, and I think this is where the really interesting kind of pernicious, somebody else used that word earlier, impact comes from, is the slippery slope argument. And again, that's been made in the past, but think about the cell phone. If I had told you in the when was the cell phone, really when was the advent, I don't know, late 90s, mid 90s, that all Americans are at some point going to run around with a device that's going to record every word they say, that's going to track their location down to the meter, that is going to analyze every single email and text that they're going to send, store it all on servers that they have absolutely no control over, and turn that over and sell it to the government whenever they want to. There would have literally been a civil war, right? But then we got the ability to call our moms and parents when we were in the car, and then there were maps, and it was really convenient, and then we could place purchases from that, and we could do all these things. We could spend hours, meaningless hours, on TikTok and Instagram, and it was great. And that's the slippery slope. You have one, and I think for AI, we're seeing this already. I love anticipatory shipping by Amazon, so they know what I'm going to order before I know. That's AI. I know that I can in the morning turn all my lights on and with smart home devices. I love all the applications and all the breakthroughs of AI, but they all come with other applications that I probably don't want. And unless we have the kinds of conversations, ongoing conversations as a country and as a global community for that matter, because we've seen outsourcing of research and innovation to other countries before, then I think we'll see a lot of that slippery slope where we end up at an endpoint that we all didn't want in the beginning, but that just happened. And I think that's the cell phone is probably one of the most striking ones. And I went from your question about neural networks and moral choices to a slightly different point. But I think it highlights really that how easy, or how both suddenly, or not rather suddenly, but how it flies under the radar, and how fundamentally disruptive those changes end up being without us even noticing.
Dietram, the slippery slope that you mentioned makes me think about the computer scientist Joseph Weizenbaum's famous discussion of exactly this issue. Weizenbaum, the creator of the first chatbot back in the 60s, accurately identified this problem and became a very outspoken critic of uncritical deployment of AI precisely for this reason, warning about, for instance, computer vision technology, which makes our lives much more convenient in many different areas, but can ultimately lead to forms of AI deployment that are not necessarily aligned with what we would have wanted originally. It was just kind of put into our lives. So I think it's important to remember that key leaders in this domain, especially scientific leaders, for decades have been warning exactly about this process. It's not just the most recent wave of people who worked at Google for a bit and now suddenly are warning about existential risks. And so we would do well to return to those earlier perspectives and see whether they've just done a good job at accurately identifying the problems that we should be focusing on now. And in this case, I would say, yeah, I mean, the slippery slope that Weizenbaum and you discussed is exactly what we should have at the front of our radars.
The slippery slope is an analogy that comes up with pretty much every new technology, as you pointed out, with cell phones. And Dietram and I served together on a committee that looked at genome editing when it was in its earlier iterations. One of the challenges with slippery slope analogies is asking what to do with it. And to become really kind of concrete about it, do you want to have absolute limits, sort of, here you're skiing out of bounds. These are absolute limits. Or do you want to have the kind of posts you would use in slalom, in which you create incentives and disincentives to guide the development in one way or another, but some people were going to miss those gates? Or do you want to rely on natural limitations, so-called speed bumps on the slippery slope that will intrinsically slow its development in a way that lets us kind of catch our breath? And it'd be really challenging when you get to the governance questions to be careful to distinguish in your own mind which of those three approaches is most appropriate for each area of the technology or each particular application. And indeed, to start by asking, do you want to regulate the technology or do you want to regulate specific applications of the technology? Because the US, in other contexts like biotech, has said each application has its own specific risks and benefits and therefore needs to be regulated differently. And so we regulate drugs as drugs, whether they're biotech related or not. We don't regulate all of biotechnology the same way. And so foods are regulated differently than drugs, than other non-medical products. These are really challenging questions, and they require us to constantly step back from our own instinct to just speak in great generalities, myself included, and to figure out how to be more precise in our thinking.
Definitely, totally agree with Professor Charo. And I would add to that what's so distinctive about AI. While I think our whole conversation has been very disciplined in sort of rejecting AI exceptionalism as being different from everything to ever come before it, where it is very different is that its development comes significantly out of the private sector. So there's an important book in political theory and political science called The Entrepreneurial State. And one of the things, this is Mariana Mazzucato, and one of the things that she maps is how the iPhone that Dietram was talking about that sits in all of our pockets, for example, is the result of all of these flows of federal taxpayer investment. So you can, the GPS system that we use that gives us the maps, the reduction in size of semiconductor chips, a lot of the technology that gave us the internet that came out of DARPA. So she's got this incredible sort of genealogy and sort of mapping of how this Apple product, for example, is actually a product that sort of comes out of all of this federal deployment of federal research and development. With AI, it's a little bit different. Certainly, there's been generations of, through those what are called AI winters when nobody was interested or thinking about AI, there was federal investment in AI research and computer science research. But, the sort of transformer technology, the new technologies that are really driving forward things like generative AI, that research comes out of the private sector. Google researchers, for example, played an important role in this. And so what it means is that even if you're posing the question of the slippery slope and where you should place it, the public, the federal government as a sort of stand-in for the public is not necessarily having an early look at these technologies in their evolution. So if we think about a technology like GPS and Alta mentioned earlier dual use, there was a time when GPS was only a military technology and a decision was made to release it to the public that allowed it to be commercialized. with these new forms of AI, we didn't have that conversation. There was no one, and we can have, I think, a lot of different perspectives on what role government should be playing right now. I think that's one of the big debates that we're having. But we certainly didn't have a moment in which leaders in government, bioethics committees like the one that Alta used to sit on and prior administration sort of said, if we can do X and Y or make sure we have X and Y guardrail, then we think it would be okay to release these. So we have technologies driven by a commercial race, driven also by an international geopolitical race that Alta rightly raised, that are just being released, as they call it, in the wild, right? And we as consumers and users and citizens are left to just deal with it, right? So I'll go back to where I began. News this morning that one of the leading AI companies says that they're soon going to be putting parental controls on chatbots, right? We could have imagined a whole different moment in which parental controls were built into chatbots before they were released. Similarly, in November of 2022, when ChatGPT sort of comes on the scene for many of us, and it certainly comes on the scene as a consumer-facing product, instead of having a situation in which we have school districts banning it and this sort of panic around the technology, we could have imagined a release of the technology that came with modules for teachers, consideration about how you use these tools in classrooms and not. A lot of the things 2.5 years out, we're still trying to figure out, there might have been a little bit more upstream forethought that would have helped us be a lot more prepared. And I think that the fact that government is not, again, we can have a lot of critiques of government, so I'm not trying to say that it is the panacea or the answer, but the fact that there's not an institutional actor with different sets of incentives than companies involved in the pre-release of these technologies, I think is a tremendous difference than some of the other ones we've been talking about as historical comparisons.
This hour has flown by and we've come up on time. I could talk to you for hours more, but you've been generous with your time. Are there any final takeaways, thoughts that you'd like to leave people with as we wrap up? Or have we covered what we'd like to?
I would just double click on what Professor Zimmermann said and say that this is one of the biggest issues of our time, and that people cannot be intimidated out of the space of like the basic governance of these technologies, and that people should, wherever they sit on the spectrum of understanding about AI, what they do understand is sort of how they want their lives to be lived and what they care about for themselves and their families. And those are the first questions you should be asking. And then we need to sort of make AI, the tools and systems and models, fit for purpose for those outcomes that we want as families, communities, and society. And
toward that end, I think the slippery slope metaphor is apt in the sense that we're on it, if we like it or not. To Alta's point, it's not a matter of are we going to get on it or not. We're on it. It's just a question of how we navigate that, and if we take the slalom poles, or if we do speed bumps, or a combination, most likely thereof, right, to get us where we really want to be as a society and as a global community, for that matter, as well, because it's an issue that is not a U.S. issue. It's a global issue.
Philosophers like to operate with the principle ought implies can. In tech, that is often inverted. Can implies ought. If you can tinker with this tool, you probably should try it. That's exactly the wrong way to go. And so I think this conversation has emphasized that just because you could use AI in some domain doesn't give you a decisive reason to go ahead. We need to ask some questions before making that judgment call. So returning to ought implies can, as philosophers would, is warranted.
I'll just add as a last thought that I'm a big, I apologize for the noise in the background. I'm a big fan of performance art. So I'd be really interested to have AI read a transcript of this conversation and provide a response to everything that we have said.
I like that idea. We didn't get to the one question I was going to let ChatGPT ask because we all had such a good discussion. But thank you to all of our panelists for your time and insights. Thank you to everyone who watched. Learn more about the Idea Fest at captimesideafest.com, and please support local journalism by becoming a member at captimes.com. Thank you all.
Thank you.